What's up, puppy friends, and welcome to my video tutorial on how to paint my Junkforce Codewright. I've got the colors I've used on the screen, so if you want to give the video a pause, you can go ahead and note those down, and then we can dive right on into the tutorial. The model itself is a conversion using the robot from the Brook Here Ironmaster kit. So I've taken the legs, and then what I've done is I've combined it with quite a number of parts from the Blood Bowl Halfling team. So I've got a torso, I've got some arms with some milliput work. Not my greatest work, but it does the job just to fill in the gaps and get the pose I want. I've added a ferret on the back just so he's got his two little helpers. I've added some grenades and a pistol to his belt. And then you can see that I've custom made some books out of plasticard. So it's a combination of, I think, 3mm or 2.5mm and 0.5mm sheets, along with some tubing cut in half for the bindings. And then I also scratch built a little bookshelf that he carries as a backpack on the back. This is my version of the Codewright to go with my Junkforce. And I like the idea of him just carrying a lot of books. I chose this head in particular. I always try and tell a little bit of a mini story with my models. And I feel like being the rules lawyer, actually kind of guy he is, he'd receive quite a few blows to his face for being a bit of a stickler. So those little touches, those part choices, I think add a lot of life. But otherwise, that's the model as is. Because we are using parts from the Votann kit, you will be able to, if you are painting Votann, also use some of the recipes on painting your Votann models. Although we are going with a bit of a grungier, more battle damaged look, not quite as clean as the Games Workshop style. So depending on what you're going for, this may or may not be right for you. We'll go ahead and paint or prime the model with some Vallejo Surface Primer Black, and then we'll dive right on in. I'm going to start with a bit of airbrushing using some very dark brown from AK Interactive. And this is largely to give myself a base coat. I'm using a lot of warm, earthy tones for this model. And rather than work from straight black, because I'm going to have to do a base coat of some sort of brown anyways, this just helps to expedite the process. From there, I'm going to start by base coating the shirt with some IDF Modern Gray. The goal is to work up to a dirty khaki color. So I want to start with a good mid-tone highlight. And then from there, I'll start mixing in progressive amounts of light earth. The shirt on this model isn't too large of a space. It's a lot of tiny little sections. So I'm not really too concerned about doing any sort of fancy blends. Just a few highlight steps. And then once I'm at pure light earth, I continue up into some pale sands. Once again, I'm just focusing on a couple of key highlights and key folds. If the shirt were a larger portion, I'd have to do a lot more blending. From there, I'm going to use Cannabis Gray to start and do a wash on all of the green elements. This is largely just to add a bit more shading into the recesses and start as a prep color for the green. From there, I'm using Gunship Green as a base coat. I'm taking care to be neat on all of the different armor panels, leaving that Cannabis Gray in the recesses. This is a little bit of a tedious step, but thankfully there's not too much of this green armor on the model. And the Gunship color green base coats pretty well. You can see that it's covering in pretty much one or two passes, so it's actually not that bad. From there, I'm going to blend from Gunship Green into Green Sky. I'm going to start with a couple of sudden transition steps, just like as if I was layering. And then from there, I'll go back in with some glazes of a mix of the Gunship Green and the Green Sky to fade out some of the rougher spots. And then I'll finish off with a highlight of APC Interior Light. This I'm focusing on primarily the upper edges and portions of the armor, in particular the thighs and the knee plates. With Leather Brown, I'm now going to start to base coat all of the leather elements. I want to make sure that I leave some of that very dark brown in the deepest crevices, but still apply a nice even base coat. From there, I'll use Tan Earth and I'll start to highlight in some of the textures of the leather. I'm using the rougher brush strokes and I'm letting those brush strokes show through to help simulate a bit more of a worn leather feel. My final highlight is with number 6 Earth Yellow. And with this, I'm not focusing on adjusting too much of the midtones. I'm concentrating this color mainly on the brighter highlights and then on sharper edges, just to add a bit of that color nuance to make the leather feel a little bit more orange. For the metallics, I'm using black metal to start my base coat. I'm just applying this very evenly over all of the metallic areas. I'm not too concerned about keeping, I guess, the individual details highlighted. I just want a nice even base coat. My next highlight is with black metal, and with this I'll do a bit of a soft blend using a bit of a feathering glazing technique. On the larger surfaces, I'll do a bit of a blend, and then on details like the chains or the loops, I'll try and pick out those individual components. Once that's done, I'll go in with a controlled glaze of Games Workshop's Nuln Oil. I'm applying this in a controlled fashion rather than firing and forgetting, just for greater accuracy, before going back in with a final highlight of Vallejo Airchrome. You need to be careful with this Airchrome color. I find that it is very reflective, and if you use too much, you end up losing a lot of the definition of the form and you flatten out the actual component. So I use this highlight very sparingly. You can see I'm concentrating this mainly on upper edges, picking out really sharp details, and then fading it out very quickly on some of the larger areas to create that blend. The next step is to paint the wood grain on his backpack, and for this I'm going to be starting with another layer of very dark brown, and then wet blending through modern gray. I'll use modern gray to create some of those wood grain patterns before highlighting it with this Dunkelgelb Ausgabe color. But first, I'll lay down a light layer of that wet dark brown color, and then you can see I'm starting to blend through that modern or Moderna gray color. I'll go about 50-50 with the blend, and then I'll take the pure modern gray color and start to freehand in the wood grain pattern. Try to add a bit of diagonality to the lines. It helps to make the wood grain feel a lot more natural rather than just straight parallel lines. And then once you have the basic pattern filled in, it's just a matter of increasing the brightness of your highlights. I like to concentrate some bright highlights on the outer edges, so on the top and the bottom. And then near the top of the wood grain, I'll pick out a couple of the lines to be a little bit brighter and leave some of them a little bit darker, just to add a bit more of like a height difference in the wood grain pattern. And then finally, I'll go back in with a bright highlight of the Dunkelgelb and add a couple of chips and scratches throughout the wood grain for that final level of detail. With World War I French Brown, I'm going to start to work on the yellow components of the model. So for this, it's just the shoulder pads. From French Brown, I'm going to start to blend into Sahara Yellow. Now, whether you wet blend or you layer, it's really up to you. I use a combination of both. My layers are semi-wet as I work through each of the transition steps. And then I do a few sudden steps as well, just like with the green armor. And then if there are rougher areas or blends that need a little bit more smoothing, I'll go back in with a variety of my midtones, so a mix of that Sahara Yellow and French Brown, or even just pure French Brown, to do a few light glazes to smooth everything back. From pure Sahara Yellow, I'll start to do the same thing into pale yellow. The goal is, I would probably say maybe a 50-50 mix of the two colors, or maybe even 70-30 pale yellow, Sahara Yellow, depending on how bright I want the actual ochre color to be. I do concentrate some of these brighter highlights on the front portion of the pad as well as the edge of the trim. With black red, I'm going to, using a fine detail brush as well as some sponge foam with some tweezers, start to apply my chip weathering. You can see that I've got a bit of the paint on the sponge, and I'm just gently dabbing it onto the various armor plates. We're looking at the shoulder pads, the foot, the knees. Where possible, I use the sponge. I find that the randomness helps to give me a lot of those really fine chips. And then what I'll do for areas where I can't get the sponge in to accurately apply the weathering, I'll go back in with a fine detail brush and I'll manually paint in the chips. It's not quite as good as the sponge, I find, but I like using both in combination for the randomness and then going back in for accuracy and to manually force or create some chips. From there, I'll take pale yellow and pale sand for the yellow, and interior light green and pale sand for the green portions, and I'll highlight the chips. So basically, wherever the light source is coming from, you want to make sure that on the opposite edge, you apply a sharp line highlight to help simulate a raised edge that's catching some of those highlights. I don't do this for all the chips, but mainly the larger ones or the more prominent ones I want to feel a little bit deeper. And this is to help give a sense of depth and realism to the battle damage, and so it doesn't just end up looking like a camo pattern. I'm going to start painting the skin with a base coat of Indian Shadow, and I'm just going to apply this over all of the skin elements. From there, I'll go straight into AK Base Flush, and I'll start to apply my highlighting. Once again, using a bit of a weathering glazing technique, I'm keeping my paints nice and diluted so that as I apply subsequent layers, I'm able to build up the intensity of the color. From Base Flush, I'm going to start mixing in progressive amounts of beige red, once again diluting the paint and using a feathering or a glazing technique to apply a bit of the color intensely in where I want the highlight to be strongest, and then pulling up the color to create a natural fade. You can see that as I'm highlighting up, I'm starting to concentrate highlights on the more prominent areas of the face. So we're looking at his forehead, eyebrows, cheekbones, the lips, the earlobes, as well as the chin. And then from beige red, we'll go into Moonray Flush doing the exact same thing. I think my final highlight for this ends up being about a 50-50. I only use pure Moonray as like a final spot highlight on some of the more like the really sharp areas. So we're looking at the top of the forehead where it meets the hairline, as well as the eyebrows. Once I'm happy with the highlighting, I'll go back in with some glazes of violet red. I've got this at about a watercolor consistency, and using this, I can smooth out some of the rougher transitions on the skin, as well as deepening some of the shadow areas as I apply more and more of these layered highlights. To paint the eyes, I'm going to start with a base coat of Tenebrous Gray, and using a fine detail brush, I'll just fill in the sockets, being careful not to paint onto the eyelids. From there, I'll use an off-white like White Sands, and I'll paint the whites of the eyes. I'll do this on both sides before going back in with Tenebrous Gray to paint in the pupils. Again, being as careful as possible, but if you do overpaint, you'll have the skin colors on hand on your palette to correct. To paint the hair, I'm going to start with a base coat of Tenebrous Gray, which I've already done here, and then I'll start my first highlight with a base coat of Dark Shadow Flush. I'm going to apply this over all of the hair, leaving the Tenebrous Gray in some of the deeper recesses, particularly on the undercuts of the hair. My next highlight is with Medium Rust. I'm not mixing the colors, I'm just going in pure, using a bit of a diluted mix, and then just pulling the color out to create that blend. My final highlight is a mix of Medium Rust and this Pale Yellow. I increase the amount of Pale Yellow in the mix as I highlight more and more of the sharper parts of the hair. I don't go overboard with this. I want that Medium Rust color in the midtones to really sell the overall color of the hair. To paint the bandages, I'm going to start with a base coat of Star Brown. This color is fairly translucent, so you'll want to do a few passes or maybe start with a little bit of a darker color as your base coat. And then from there, I'll highlight with Mojave White. Again, this color is fairly translucent out of the bottle, so I'm able to just build up progressive layers of this color to increase the overall brightness of the final highlight. Using dark brown, Thar Brown, and Mojave White, which is a similar recipe to the bandages, I also paint the pages in the books. I use the dark brown to deepen the base coat as well, to help define some of the page lines. So to paint the books, I'm going to start with a few base coats using a blue, a dark reddish black, French brown, and amethyst blue. So for the books that I want red, I'll paint with this dark red color. I'll use that dark sea blue for books I'm going to be painting in green or blue. I'll use the World War I French brown for books I'm painting in yellow. And then I'm using the amethyst blue for books I'm painting in purple. The key at this stage with the base coats is to be as neat as possible. You want to get a nice even base coat. And in particular, you want to pay attention to where the book covers turn in and meet the pages. You want to be very careful and neat with those. To paint the red, the recipe is the reddish black, burnt red, blood red, and scarlet red. And for this book and for all the books following, I'm just going to show you in sequence, sped up I think about 4 or 5 times the speed. What I'm doing here is I'm basically wet blending each of the different books in turn. So I start with that base color and I just lay down and I go through each of the colors in sequence. And while the paints are still a little wet on the book, I'll apply my next layer and just slowly wet blend through up into my final highlights. I exaggerate the highlights and the blends on the books, and in particular where the cover meets the spine, I exaggerate a bit of that highlight and shadow tone where they are side by side to give a little bit more increased contrast, both from the covers and the bindings, and then from the front and the backs of the book. I also add a final bright edge highlight over all of the books just to add a bit of pop and definition. One of the things I wanted to make sure that I did was to make sure that I didn't have books of the same color side by side. So you can see that as I'm painting through each of the books in turn, I don't have 2 red books touching, I don't have 2 blue books touching, things like that. I also avoided having yellow books be on the tops. So on his left and right arm, I have a red book on his left arm, and I think the right book ends up being a blue one. I avoided having yellow one just because I know it's kind of a difficult color to paint and I didn't want to worry about blending it on the flat surface. I can, I just don't want to do it. And then I also didn't want the value of the yellow book to overpower the front of the model. I think that I wanted the focus to be on his face, his hair, and his chest. And so I deliberately had a darker book on his right hand with just the yellow one peeking underneath to not fight for that value. For the books, particularly on the back and on the spines, to create a little bit more of an interesting blend, I did a highlight on both sides of the binding with a mid or shadow tone running down the middle. I don't know if this is necessarily the most accurate way to blend these, but I felt that it would give me a little bit more of an interesting blend, or I guess a highlight transition on the covers that is much more aesthetically pleasing to look at. So I made that choice just to break a bit of those highlight rules and rather than be a strict adherence. I worked through some of the darker books as well, largely because of the way that it sequences. If I make a mistake and I overpaint onto the French brown of the yellow book, it would be easier to correct. And then similarly, when I'm painting the yellow book as the final, any overpaints onto the darker books are much easier to correct than vice versa. If I had started by blending the yellow books first and then gone on to some of the darker ones, if I had made a mistake and overpainted, say, a purple or a red or a blue onto the yellow, that would have been much, much harder to correct because yellow paints by nature are just much more translucent than something like a red or a blue or a purple. So when you're painting details like this, I think it's worth considering the sequence just to make your painting a little bit more efficient and a little bit quicker, especially if you're going to be assembly lining some of these colors. I also chose to make this yellow recipe a little bit more saturated. You can see that my highlights go through a volcanic yellow and a yellow from AK, which are a lot more saturated and vibrant than the ochre of the shoulder pads. It's just a way to have the yellow be separate from the 2 different materials so that the books and the shoulder pads They still read as yellow from far away, but you can tell that they're different materials. One is a bit more desaturated on the armor, and then one is just the more vibrant book. I think I knew early in I wanted the yellow books to be some sort of dummies book. I thought it'd be pretty funny to have those. So once we've got the book colors down, it's time to work on the lettering. On something this small, I think it's really important and useful to map out or plan out the book title. What you want to do is you want to find the center to determine the spacing of the letters on either side. So for this book I'll be painting, the title is Outwitting Squirrels. So you can see that I found the center of each of the words I in outwitting and R in squirrels, and that gives me a sense of which letter needs to end up in the middle, and then you can space it out. Actually paint the letters, I'm using some sort of off-white for the brighter books or some sort of off-black for the darker books. Thin brush, diluted paint. I start with a quick sketch of the lettering, and because I've done this a lot and I have an art background, I'm pretty comfortable in visualizing the spacing of the letters as I paint it through. So you can see that I basically start left to right and I write it through because I can visualize where I need to start, where the middle is, and where the end needs to be. If you have a harder time visualizing this, I recommend painting the letters on either end. So for squirrels, it would be the S on either end, and then you paint the R for the middle, and then you work your way in for each of the sections in turn. This way you can more evenly space it out as opposed to painting left to right or right to left. You can see that in my first pass, I did end up making a few mistakes with the thickness of the lettering. I lost the detailing on the Q. I find that curves, so letters like O or S or R or Q, tend to be a little harder for me, so I know that I make those mistakes. But that's fine because you can always go back in with your various green tones or whatever the color of the book is, and you can use a technique called erasing, where you overpaint back onto the white to erase and sharpen your detailing. And you work your way back and forth. You paint your white lettering, you erase with your base colors to correct, and then you go back in with some white to just sharpen, and you're basically fine-tuning until you're happy with the end result. I know up close it does feel a little bit rough, but from far away, we're looking at 2, 3, 4 feet away as a tabletop piece. I think the lettering looks pretty clean. If this were a display piece, I'd probably spend a little bit more time on this. Once the lettering is done, I'll go back in with some glazes of green just to knock everything back and shade it all down. For the scarf, I want to paint a bit of a tartan pattern. Always useful to find reference. For complex details like this, you never want to try and freehand from memory unless you've done it a lot. And for this, it's useful to break down the geometric pattern into very simple steps. So for this, I'm going to start with some dark lines to basically map out where the pattern will start. So I'm starting with the big blue band. I use a dark sea blue to paint the lines on either side, and then I believe it's a light Prussian blue to paint the middle of that dark blue band. Once I've got that down, I'll turn the model horizontally and basically paint the horizontal dark lines that cut across the entire pattern. Once again, using that dark sea blue. And then once I've got that positioning, I'll go in with a brighter blue to paint in the brighter segments on the blue band. Once that's done, I'll then bisect that with another blue line to cut the vertical blue in half. And this is what I mean by the sequencing. You're able to, rather than paint the individual squares, work big and refine until your small details. Same thing with the green. Once I've got the blue lines and as a guide, I can go in with a brighter green highlight, brighten up the center portions before I then cut it apart again with a dark blue line. For the ferrets, I'm going to be using a reference for the ferrets, primarily a dark brownish orange color with some white markings around the face. So for the skin, I'm using Tenebris Gray, very dark blue, or brown, sorry, and this Dunkelgelb color. And I'm pretty much just doing some quick blends. The ferrets don't have a lot of detail showing, so it's fairly easy to work the highlights through each of the sections. What I do make sure to do is I don't go overly bright with the Dunkelgelb. I think my final highlight ends up being about a 50-50 of the very dark brown and the Dunkelgelb color, and this will help to give contrast for the white markings, which I'll paint afterwards. So using an off-white, for this I'm using Mojave White, I'm going to paint the markings on the face. Again, use reference, don't try and make it up on the spot. So for this, I'm concentrating this around the muzzle, I'm leaving a band for the eyes, and then I'm painting a circle around the face to frame it, and then adding some markings on the edges of the ears as well. Once that's done, I'll use black to paint the eyes, and then I'll go in with a mix of a violet red and beige red to do the pink on the noses. Once the model has been matte varnished, I'll go back in with gloss varnish and just cover the nose and the eyes for a little bit of reflection. Once the model is painted, it's time to apply some oils. And for this, I'm just using a burnt sienna from Van Gogh as a wash. So using some mineral spirits and a synthetic brush, I mix up a fairly diluted wash, almost watercolor in consistency, and I start to apply this to the model. What I'm really focusing on is to get a bit of weathering on the coloring. When this oil wash dries, it is fairly translucent, so when you're applying it, don't be afraid to apply it a little bit more heavily. And because it is an oil wash, you can always go back in with mineral spirits afterwards and erase. And then finally, to base the miniature, I'm using Vallejo's Earth Texture. This is an acrylic-based material, so you can use water to dilute, and you can use your brush to paint it along. So as you can see here, I use a tool to apply a large amount of the paste on, and then I use a brush to fine-tune the placement of the material. Once that's cure, I use some winter tufts from Army Painter, and I'll apply a couple to the base. I'll dry fit them first to get the positioning right, before using a dot of super glue to fix the tuft to the base. You'll want to make sure that you give this sufficient time to dry before moving on to the next step. Otherwise, the super glue will react with the powders and the mineral spirits. Using dark yellow ochre from Vallejo, I apply a heavy coat of weathering powders to the base. I concentrate a lot around the tufts and around where the model comes into contact with the base. The goal is to really darken the powders and push it more into a yellow ochre color as opposed to a bright sandy beach color. And then once I'm happy with the end result, I'll go back in with some mineral spirits and a spritzer bottle, and I'll just saturate the base. This will help to act as a fixer and protect it from handling during gameplay. Once that's fully evaporated, call it about 45 minutes to an hour. I'll paint the base trim black. I'll give the entire model a matte varnish. For this, I use Mr. Hobby's Super Clear, and that will finish off the model. And that wraps up this tutorial video on my Junkforce Codewright. If you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like and subscribe to my channel for more awesome weekly content. If you want to check out my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the video description below. And as always, until next time, happy hobbying.